Mozilla. Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 3. I'm here with my friend John Guerin, who's also a photographer. Although he's not a professional photographer, he is somewhat of a hobbyist, but he does have some really nice equipment and he does pride himself on being an artist and really doing what he wants with photography. Okay, so I did an introduction for you, but why don't you tell us a little bit about like your background in photography?
So I've been doing photography for the last 30 years, since I was about 9 years old in one form or another. My early experience in photography was doing a summer camp, and we had a photography class where we shot 35 millimeter film and we got to develop it and we got to do prints in a darkroom. So my first experience was actually doing real photography, not digital photography. So I've been doing it since the beginning. When I told my mom I wanted to do photography like as a living, she was like, no, you don't want to do that. There's no money in it. And so my motivation for it immediately dwindled down the tube. And then when I was about 22, I had a friend who had an old Canon AE1 film camera. And I was like, can I play with this? And she was like, yeah, absolutely. So I took it and I went to the Hollywood sign and I photographed the Hollywood sign and other parts of the area, and then went down to Hollywood, went on Hollywood Boulevard, photographed a bunch of stuff, and then had it developed. And I was like, oh, I like this, right? And you have the photo from the Hollywood sign.
So that's the photo that I gave to Penninger.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So I had it for a while, and then you took it and then you gave it away to someone else. So yeah, I really wanted to start photographing people, but I didn't really have the motivation. And a good friend of ours, Brooke, was like, oh, you could photograph me. And I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds fun. Let's do it. So we went down to the beach and I photographed her around the beach and I photographed the beach and got it developed. And I was like, I can do this. So after that, I decided to get a digital camera and started just shooting, and then kind of built up from there.
And then here we are today. Just so everybody knows, John is kind of the person who got me started in photography, because he used to take me around and make me do photos with him when he was a photographer, when I was doing music. And then we went to this artist retreat in the Caribbean and I did a seminar on photography, and that's when I decided that I wanted to do photography. And John was nice enough to let me have his camera for like probably over a year and just play with it and just keep it as my own. John's the reason why I started. So I wanted to have him here today to do another episode because, you know, in his life, he's continued as a hobbyist photographer and not made it his profession, but just made it his artistry. Whereas I've gone and made it my profession. And so I thought it'd be good to have him here to do some frequently asked questions, to answer some common misunderstandings that people have when they're first starting out or when they don't know anything about photography. And if you're listening to this and you say to yourself, well, I'm not a photographer. In this day and age, with an iPhone, everybody's a photographer. If you go to that event with your friends and you wear your cute dress or your nice tux and you want a photo, you're a photographer. So this can be applicable to you. I guess to start from where you are now, right? You're pretty advanced for a person who's not a professional, who doesn't, make it their career to be a photographer. Is there like a main question that you are constantly confronted with, whether it's you asking it or whether people who you know that know you're a photographer ask you?
I think the biggest thing that I get asked is like what kind of camera I should get. That's always the first thing people ask me. And I'm always like, it's not exactly the camera that you get. It's more the equipment and the quality of the lens that you get. You could get a Canon, you could get a Nikon, you could get a Sony, you could get a cheaper version of it. It's all a matter of what direction you want to go and what company you want to stick with, because you're going to make lens purchases and you're going to want quality glass, because when you don't have quality glass, then you have images that aren't very sharp ever, and that can be very discouraging for moving forward.
That is a very common question that I get too. I mentioned that in the last podcast episode. Now here's the thing, what you said about picking your cameras and your lenses and that type of stuff, that is a very, very true statement. But I'm going to look at this question from a different point of view, because instantaneously when somebody asks me, what kind of camera do you have? That tells me that they don't understand enough about photography to ask the question, because whatever camera you have, that's the best camera that there is. You don't have any of those cameras, so it doesn't matter. What matters is the camera that you have. And as I've referred to earlier as like, photography is writing with light. So what most people think makes a great image is a great camera, but that's not true. What makes a great image is a great photographer.
Right. And I'd like to add to that though. I think it's whatever camera you have is the best camera is a great way to start and to get comfortable with it. The main reason why you would want to branch into the next level of camera is because you have a range of options and settings and different things that you can do with it. Usually when someone's asking me that question, that's the next stage that they're at. They're like, I do love taking photos. I want to go to the next stage. Well, like when you were trying to decide what kind of camera you wanted, I was like, well, I like Canon. This is the research that I've done. I think this is the camera that would be good for you. And then you can invest more in lenses, but you can also keep the initial investment as low as possible.
I guess I never thought about that. I kind of have a little bit of preconceived notions about when people ask me what kind of camera I have, and I assume that they're, just thinking that. But that's true. I guess if they're truly interested in, taking their craft to the next level, then it would be a good question to answer in terms of like, oh, it's this type of camera, or, to dig into it and say like, okay, well, what are you trying to do? I guess if that's the case, I think you have a good point. All right. So my next question is, when you first started photography, did you have this idea that doing photography was hard?
At first, honestly, I didn't find it very difficult. But as I continued to photograph, I started to get into areas where I was able to imagine more of the image that I wanted to create. At first, it was like, oh, this looks like it would be a cool photo. And then I would take the photo and it would come out in a decent way. And then I started to get frustrated because I didn't quite have the tools that I needed and didn't understand the camera enough to achieve that. Like when I was doing the Hollywood photo, I was like, oh man, like I really want to get this one shot. And I actually happened to random person saw me taking the photos and saw the camera that I had and had experience using the camera. I was literally just pointing and shooting the camera, and he told me, oh, there's actually settings on this camera. And I was like, what? He's like, yeah, this is the first computerized camera that existed, and it actually has a built-in light meter. And if you look in there, you can see what you need to put your settings at to achieve the best lighting for that scene. And I was like, oh, no way, which was why I think that Hollywood photo came out pretty decent, was because I was starting to learn that there was this whole other world of settings out there.
Well, thank God for that guy.
Yeah.
Because that photo was on my wall for like 3 years.
And it was on mine for 10. And now it'll be on another wall for many years to come.
One thing I wanted to mention is that when you take on any craft, you have to find out what the like primary actions are, whether it's cooking or photography or painting, whatever it may be. In photography, you're trying to expose properly. That's the first thing you're trying to do, right? You're balancing your settings so that you can get an image in your camera that people can see. It's not too bright. It's not too dark. It's not too blurry, right? That's the first thing you need to do. When I first started, it was just a pure love. And I wasn't shooting people. I was shooting random stuff on the street. And I had to teach myself every time I went out and I did a photo and I would get it back and put it in Lightroom, it would be overexposed or underexposed or too blurry. And I would go, okay, how do I fix that? And that's how I kind of drilled that in for myself.
I think I'd like to also add that sometimes you want to make sure that you don't always get so caught up in that you miss a moment.
This is a good point. The thing is if you don't have your basics on your settings down, you're going to be so worried about that you're going to miss moments no matter what, even if you're concentrating on the moment. If you don't have your camera set properly and you're just focused on getting moments and you get a moment, but it's overexposed, it was pointless to get that moment. So that's why I say the primary action is really get that exposure triangle down so that you can nail your exposure every time. And on top of that, what I always say to people when they ask me things about photography is I always ask them like, well, what kind of photography do you want to do? Like, what are you most interested in shooting? Like, what's your reason behind doing this? Some people are like, I'm a dad and I just really want to have really good images of my kids. And so it really depends on what the purpose for doing this subject is. And so what I say too is on top of that is really get that in there, really define what that is. Because I think for you, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for you really wanted to like express yourself artistically and you had certain ideas and certain things you wanted to do. And that was your whole outlet of photography. So that didn't put walls around what you were doing. Like, Tuesday you could do this, Saturday you could do this, the next week you could do something completely different, right?
That was kind of how I started. But then when I saw the effects that my photographs were creating on people, the hat, like, especially once I started doing like family and like relatives and other people, when I started seeing the effects that good photos could create for them in their world, that was more of an eye opener for me, because then my goal at the end of the day was to achieve that reaction. The beauty of the photo was in the moment that I captured and what I was able to give to the person.
And so that's mostly what you do now, like when you do photographs for people, whether they're paid or whether you're just like doing a favor or giving a Christmas gift. That's what you do. Like you do families and babies and pets, right?
Yeah, exactly. And people are always just like, oh my God, like you captured their essence, or, you know, they look so great. Like, this is amazing. And they get super excited. And I'm like, that for me is very rewarding.
And so what would you say your approach is then when you're getting ready to do like a family or capture a moment?
When I'm starting to get ready to photograph anyone or family or any kids or anything like that, the first step for me is to kind of dial in the exposure and get comfortable with the exposure, because I know that I'm going to be interacting with the kids or the family, and I don't want to be messing with that later. So I kind of get that dialed in, because sometimes I'm a little bit out of practice. And so I just kind of need to like get back in that rhythm of like making the adjustments on the fly that I need to. And I'll kind of judge based on the lighting, and I shoot a lot of natural light. So I kind of judge what value I want that at.
So do you shoot on manual mode, or do you shoot on like aperture value or whatever the time value?
I typically shoot on aperture value or aperture priority. So that basically gives priority to the opening on the lens. And usually I will shoot with a larger lens opening, which gives a shallower depth of field.
Yeah, so for all the listeners who don't understand what that means, if you have it on manual mode, you can choose all the different settings. One of them being how big the lens is, one of them being how fast the shutter of the camera opens and closes, and one of them being how sensitive to light the sensor is. And when you put the camera on aperture priority, it's basically telling the camera, this is what I want the aperture to be. This is how wide I want the lens to be open. Change the shutter speed and change their sensitivity to the sensor, but don't change how big the lens opens. And so since you shoot on aperture priority, what is your thought process in terms of like the lighting? If you're outside, are you changing your body position to get a better lighting? Like how do you take that into account, or do you just deal with it in post?
I will typically just make the adjustments in the camera on the fly, and I will try to, you know, if it's a sunny day and they're in the sun, I try to make it so that there's no harsh shadows on their faces. And if I can't get that, then I'm trying to shoot with the sun behind them so that their face is more evenly lit. Or I take them and throw them in the shade, and then that way I don't have to worry about that at all.
Yeah, and see, the reason I asked that was because I've noticed that when you do iPhone photos, right? Like you're setting up a photo of, you know, your girlfriend or whoever, and, you know, she wants to be a fashion influencer. And so you take this photo of her and then you show her the photo. She's like, oh my God, this looks so good. But I've noticed that like once you take the photo, the iPhone does its like AI thing where it adjusts for like skin brightness and it makes all these automatic settings to where like the photo that you see as soon as you take it is not actually the photo that you took because of the AI, right? I think that a lot of people who, you know, use cameras for work or for, you know, Instagram in more of a serious manner, I think they start to get an inflated sense of themselves as a photographer. And the reason I asked you that was because I wanted to make a point that even though you're a natural light photographer, you are moving around and getting different angles based on the light. To me, that's what an actual photographer who understands photography and lighting does, is they don't just fix it in post, they adjust themselves. And you may be watching somebody and never notice that they actually do this. You may see them move and just not know why they're moving. But generally, I think that, you know, if you're a natural light photographer, this is why. It's because you're, you know, positioning your camera and yourself in a place that's advantageous to getting the shot, but also that's, you know, favoring the good light and the quality of light.
As a natural light photographer, I do have a lot of trouble with the harsh lights. And there are many times where in post I'm doing edits and that harsh light ruined a perfectly good photo. And I wish at that time that I had a fill light. Unfortunately for me, I don't really, it's, when you're photographing children or families, you don't really have that option sometimes to just throw up a flash and move it around quickly and achieve the lighting that you want. But when you have a more controlled environment with adults where you can do that kind of thing, having that flash can really make such a huge difference, and you have so many more photos that are usable.
Also, I think that if you were getting paid, a few $1,000s for one of these shoots, you would probably want to go out and purchase a flash that you could use for that, and then pay an assistant to show up and make sure that that assistant moves the light. Right. But if you're getting paid, a couple $100 for, a morning, you're probably not going to do that.
Oh yeah, absolutely not. I mean, yeah, I'm doing photo shoots for free because I'm, the hobbyist, but also if I do get paid, I'm not getting paid a lot of money because, sometimes the people aren't a budget or whatever, but that's kind of the sacrifice that they're making, is they're not going to have that level of quality.
If a person needs photography for a personal reason, such as, they want to document their family for the holidays, or for an event, an anniversary, or something like that, that is going to be something that they're going to have as a keepsake for themselves forever, and they're going to put it on their wall, and that's going to be the end of it. It's not something that they're going to go and put on a website and use it to make money. So generally, when you're looking at hiring a commercial photographer like me, you're going to be paying a rate that reflects that you're going to be taking my work and using it to now make money off of, right? And that's quite a different story than like, hey, can you come over and take a really cute photo of my kids so I can frame it and put it on my wall and treasure that keepsake for the rest of my life. I think that's one thing to think about as a person who's a client, or even an aspiring hobbyist, or even an aspiring photographer. There are different uses for photography, and depending on what use you're looking at can depend on the cost of doing that.
Yeah, and if you go to any of these high-end photo shoots, there's a lot of people involved in making those photo shoots happen. It's not one photographer doing it. You've got 2 or 3 different assistants. You've got a person handling the lighting. You've got other people doing many different hats.
I'll get a call from a lawyer or a doctor, and they'll say, hey, we're making a new website. We need a bunch of photos. I want to hire you. And I'll say, cool. And so usually I'll have 3 meetings on Zoom before I actually show up to do the shoot. And I try to prep them as much as I can, but every once in a while, I still get this like, wow, I didn't realize this was going to be such a big deal. I think most people in the world don't understand what it takes to make a set of great images. I think there's this weird idea that, because I have this iPhone and, oh, look, I took this beautiful picture and I'm on this guy's website. And, oh, look at this amazing picture. Oh, it's easy. He's just going to show up with his camera, click, 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 and we're going to be done. But the actual fact is, like you said, when I go to a client, I have a makeup artist. I usually have an assistant, and I usually have a schedule, and I usually have an entire shot list of things that we're trying to accomplish for the day. And it ends up being a very involved process. So if you're thinking of the subject of photography, whatever involvement you have in it, just know that the effort it takes is probably a lot more than you thought.
Yeah, the process of doing a photo shoot is never, when it's a family, it can be a little bit simpler, but there's always a story that you're trying to tell. And for instance, like one of the last weddings that we did a few years ago together, there's this downtime, but then there's a lot of planning that's going into what shots we want to get, what is the timeline of events. And we know that we have, especially with a wedding, it's high pressure because you only have one opportunity for many different shots. We had the downtime, but then there was a lot of planning that was going into every little event that was about to occur. You have you have the walk down the aisle, you have the groom shots of their reaction to seeing the dress for the first time. It was a lot of work. And, most people wouldn't see that. They would see us just hanging out and just going click, 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 but they don't know of all the things that we were just discussing in the background and things that we were coordinating with other people, from this person to that person, just bouncing around, making sure that it all went off without a hitch.
There may be times where the wedding party is getting dressed and we don't have anything to do. So we're sitting outside on our phone, but then it's like, okay, the wedding party's dressed. Now they're going to do their first walk or whatever it may be. And you have 5 minutes to get the shots you need. As a photographer, you have to be very educated on your tools. You have to be very educated on the type of shoot you're doing. You have to be very educated on the circumstances you're getting into, because inevitably you will be posed with a problem that you will need to solve. There's always something that happens that you need to go like, oh, okay, well, we'll just do this. And it can't be at the disposal of any of the shots that you're doing or anything that you've promised the client.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of my early weddings, I got a pretty good number of decent shots, but I wasn't able to pivot. I didn't know my tools as well as I should have. And when I went through to finally edit the photos, I was like, oh man, that photo would have been great if I knew what I was doing. And years later, looking at those photos, I was like, oh yeah, I know what I should have done. I should have done this and this and this, and that photo would have been perfect. And because I didn't have those tools under my belt and hadn't utilized them, looking back, I'm like, yeah, that could have been so much better.
Yeah, and I think that has a lot to do with sort of connecting the theory of photography and the actions. And I think a lot of people when they first start out is they just get a camera and they start clicking and they kind of do it a little bit backwards, which is totally fine. But I think as a professional, you need to get to the point where you understand that the whole purpose behind lighting is this, and the way that you make great lighting is this. And then you connect that so you can do that really quickly, flawlessly when you're shooting a couple or when you're shooting a professional photo or even a family photo, whatever it may be. And I think if you can connect the ideas behind why and how to your muscle memory, then you have a good chance of being a good photographer.
A couple of years ago when everything kind of started clicking for me was that exposure triangle and just how the aperture, the film sensitivity, and the speed of the shutter all like interrelated. And I kind of realized it's just like there's this equilibrium like that occurs that when you get that, you're just like, it's such a relief. You're like,
When you're doing something professionally, it's your job to solve problems that exist. A client calls you and says, hey, I need you for this. So they're looking for you to solve that problem. And so if you can look at their problem and then look deep into it at a root level and then solve the whole thing, be able to predict like their overall problem, because they might not be educated in your subject enough to know. For instance, I had a client who was like, I have hired 2 photographers and I keep getting these photos that are fine, but they're just not my vibe. And so what I understood by that was like they have a certain brand and they didn't feel represented in those photos by that brand. And so then I was able to look at their brand and notice that it was like a very dark and intense and moody brand. And the photos that they were given were like light and soft and airy. And that's not what they wanted. So then I was able to say, okay, this is how I'm going to solve your problem. We're going to do photos like this. And I showed them some images of like some very moody photos and they were like, yes. And so the good thing about that was that won their trust. They really trusted me, but also it got them what they wanted, and I've just seen so many people who want to do their thing. This is what I do. On the last podcast, I was talking to Jake about, one of our friends who's a wedding photographer, and she has a very specific style that she shoots. And when people call her, she doesn't change her style. She says, this is my style. And if you want that, hire me. And I can imagine that sometimes she has clients who don't understand that and who maybe hire her and want something different and don't get something different, because she's not solving that particular person's problem. When she's successful, it's because the people who have the problem that she solves, she gets in contact with them and they hire her. But if you have anybody who has a different problem, who's like, I want this type of wedding photo, and she's solving this type of wedding photo, she's not solving their problems. So to me, it's really important as a photographer, or even as a client, to get that point right, which is like the client has a problem, the photographer needs to be able to solve exactly that problem and not add a bunch of stuff that doesn't need to be solved or do a bunch of other things that maybe solve different problems that don't exist.
I mean, at the end of the day, it's like you're hiring a professional. You hire professionals to do things that you can't do. I work with lawyers. They are some of the smartest people I've ever met. I do accounting on a daily basis, and I'm explaining accounting concepts to them that they don't understand. And they're like, I could never understand that. And I'm like, I could never understand law the way that you understand it. And that's the thing. You have people who specialize in different things. You have an accountant who specializes in taxes or in audits or in law firms or in construction companies. So you hire a photographer that specializes in the field that you are in. For instance, you do people who do cosmetics and lawyers and professional stuff. So they would hire you because you know that field and you know that profession and how to capture it.
One of the main things I get in my everyday work is, as much as I prep my clients, as much as I go over how the shoot's going to be, occasionally I get these clients who are a little bit like overbearing. They want to make sure that I'm doing what they want me to do. And I've noticed that this is a thing, you know, and there's not really any way to get them to trust you except for showing them. In my first 3 years of my career, I would just shoot and show them on the camera and they'd be like, oh, that looks great. But the problem with that is the camera's display is not correct. It's not calibrated correctly. So it looks differently than once you get on the laptop. And so then they'd get their gallery and be like, wait, what is this? This looks so different. So what I started doing was I started plugging my computer into my laptop so that the images live go into the computer, and then there's a color correction edit done as the photo goes in, and then they can see it on a 17-inch screen. This is what the photo looks like, and they go, oh my God, yes, you get me. And then that kind of kills any anxiety or any micromanaging that the client may have, just because they're able to actually see that. And I think that in this field, there's such a hit and miss with different photographers and their skill levels and their ability to create images that are needed and wanted by specific clients. And so I think that it's really good to, as a business person, for me, to have solved some of these problems so that my clients can have more confidence in hiring me. All right, guys. So that wraps up episode 3. I'd like to thank Johnny for being here and allowing me to just spring this on him last minute and participating. So thank you for participating.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And I hope that today's episode taught you guys something, gave you some new insight into life and photography. And until the next episode, see you later. Thank you for listening to the Fazilla podcast. If you'd like to know more, you can check out my website at www.fazilla.com. That's FAZILLAH.com. You can also follow me on Instagram at fazilla.photo. Stay tuned for more episodes where I'll discuss photography and how it relates to life, marketing, and other subjects as well.